Welcome everyone. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners as the original custodians of this land, including the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people in the northern part of the city of Boroondara, and pay my respects to their elders past, present, and the elders from other communities who may be here today. My name is Stephanie Sacco and I'm one of the curators at the Town Hall Gallery. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to this online panel discussion for our current major exhibition, Shelter in Place. I'm thrilled to welcome our panellists, artists Kevin Chin, Mason Kimber, and Polly Stanton, who all feature in this exhibition. And we also have today Amanda Donohoe, the CEO of Servants Community Housing, an organisation that provides rooming house accommodation for homeless people in the city of Boroondara. I'm also delighted to introduce Vicky Lamb, Associate Lecturer at RMIT Architecture and Urban Design, who will be moderating today's discussion. So just a little bit of housekeeping for today's session. After the discussion, there'll be an opportunity for questions from the audience. So if there is something that you would like to ask the panel, please at any time feel free to type it in to the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And I will read out your questions towards the end of the session. And please also note that this session is being recorded and a recording will be available online after the session. I will start by giving a brief introduction to the exhibition, just for some context. So Shelter in Place features works by 7 Australian artists which explore the relationship between human beings and architecture. The exhibition focuses on the ways our built environment is used to foster ideas of home, shelter and belonging. Through different mediums, the artists examine themes such as ownership and the great Australian dream, displacement and dispossession, and materiality and memory. The artists in Shelter in Place encourage us to reflect on our own lived experiences and interactions with the built environment, both at a communal level and also at a personal level, and how we might find solace and belonging within them. Living at a time of a global pandemic has further encouraged this self-reflection. Our relationships with our homes, neighbourhoods and cities has undoubtedly been thrown into sharper focus in the last 18 months, with our experiences of repeated lockdowns and travel limits forcing us to confront the built environment that we find ourselves within for days, weeks or months. The works in this exhibition challenge us to think about how we might imagine, design and sustain our places and spaces, and in turn, what they say about us both individually and collectively as a society. Shelter in Place features new and recent work by artists Alfredo and Isabel Aquilizan, Kevin Chin, Mason Kimber, Eugenia Lim, Shannon Lyons and Polly Stanton. I will now share a quick little PowerPoint which features a selection of images from the exhibition. And first up, I'll invite Kevin to speak about his two paintings in the show.
Thanks, Steph.
Thank you. Hopefully you can see that.
My paintings, broadly speaking, they mix up different cultural elements and pull together different places from different parts of the world into one cohesive scene to think about how we create a sense of home and belonging for ourselves. They're large in scale and they work in the oil on linen tradition to directly reference the traditional art institution. And by doing that, I'm hoping to represent some of the different minority groups that I think have been left out of the broader Australian art history canon. So these two paintings that are in this exhibition were from my series called Structural Equality, which references the term structural inequality, which has, of course, become a bit of a buzzword lately that, of course, is about that different segments of society, the discrepancies between them that in the past we may have thought about being due to individual failures, now we understand as being to do more with the institutional structures and how they set some people up to succeed and others to fail. So that's the perspective that I'm coming into this show from.
Great. And this is your other work that you have in the show, Another Rung, which is from the same series.
Yes. And I can tell you a bit more about each painting specifically as we talk about the themes in today's discussion.
Sounds good. And there's the works in situ in the exhibition. Thank you, Kevin. And now I'll invite Mason to speak about his work, Strata Step and Strata. Over to you, Mason.
Thanks, Steph. So these works are from a recent exhibition down in Sydney called Strata, and they're based on sort of encounters in the local area where the gallery itself, Cronenberg Maze Right Gallery, is located, where the exhibition was held. And it's also where I lived, so I'm in a new place right now. But the idea was to kind of go on these walks and to encounter surfaces and sort of details that I then use molding techniques to capture different material textures and objects to then bring back into the studio and kind of rework through a sort of an iterative process into these fragments. So my work really looks at the surface of architecture and painting as a kind of site where all these material relations kind of play out. And in doing that, think about the relation between the person like me, the subject, and the building, the place, the physical thing, and somehow sort of come to an understanding through the process of making. And this works here contains some of these fragments, which are set up in this frame structure. And I like the idea of the fragment because it keeps things open. It's not something that's full. So with that work there, you're able to kind of walk around and encounter all sides of the fragments. And then behind there on the wall are these relief panels, which are kind of like housings that were intended to house the fragments. And some of them do have fragments in the exhibition, but the one here in Shelter in Place has just these kind of shelving forms. So you could imagine them being filled with a fragment or memory.
Here's a beautiful detail as well from the exhibition.
Yeah, so some of them on the far left have a direct imprint of that's a drain on the alleyway behind the gallery, like a sewage drain. And then other fragments have kind of like an amalgamation or an assemblage of different other fragments which have gone through a process. So there's this idea that, yes, there's this kind of direct translation of a place, but also it's shifting and it's not complete.
Wonderful. Thanks, Mason. And now over to you, Polly.
Thanks, Steph. So this moving image and sound work was filmed in Iceland in the West Fjords, which is an isolated, probably the most isolated region of Iceland, which is a fairly isolated country in general. And I've always been really fascinated with the concept of the eerie and of ghosts in a particular way, but through a landscape and through certain sites, usually sites of extraction or sites that have been used and then left in some way. And I think Iceland really presented to me in general this incredible sort of space of abandonment. So there's across the country, there's thousands of farmhouses that have been abandoned over the last 30 or so years as there's been economic and social shifts across the country. And it just presented this really interesting sort of site to work in. And I was really fascinated in just how light moved and changed, but just also the sort of really shifting space and sound of these abandoned sites as well. And I think a scholar, Mark Fisher's idea of the eerie, which is a failure of both absence and presence. And I think that was really very much in my mind when I was doing field work in Iceland, but then making this work in particular and thinking about these sites as both absence and presence all wrap up in once. They're indications and markers of something that has occurred or some sort of life that has been there that now isn't and yet hasn't truly left. To me, that also relates very much from what I understand of the idea of the Icelandic elves and how certainly the older generation, their sort of reverence around this sort of concept of elves, which are from what I understand, what was explained to me, are actually ghosts or an understanding of ghosts in the landscape. And so houses, if people would traditionally leave a site or a residence of some kind, they would leave it fully furnished for ghosts to inhabit. So they have a really different relationship to this idea of the ghost. And so these spaces, as I say, are markers and indicators of great shifts that are happening socially in the country, but then also they are these sort of sites of remembrance and of housing for past entities or ideas of the past, of legacies of some kind. And so this work is 3 specific rooms in an abandoned farmhouse, just durational long takes, with a multi-channel sound work for the sounds taken from inside the space as well. So the sound is mixed and layered. The soundtrack is constructed in some way, but all the sounds directly come out of that environment at the same time.
Wonderful. Thanks, Polly. Okay, thanks the artists for sharing some insight into their work. And I'll now hand over to Vicky to lead our discussion. Thanks, Vicky.
Hi, thanks, Stephanie, for running this introduction and for the artists to introduce their work. And mostly thanks, Stephanie, for curating this really beautiful show that I had the chance to see on Wednesday. So I'm also very happy to be invited to speak on this panel with the artists and also Amanda Donohoe. And I was really particularly enamored by this really provocative and topical title of the show, Shelter in Place, inviting us to think about our relationship with our environment. So in opening the conversation with our artists and Amanda, I guess the way we would frame the conversation to start off with is to ask 2 questions. As an architecture student, one of our professors would say that there are only 2 questions: who are we and who do you want to be? Who are you and who do you want to be? And I guess that also provokes us to think about what do our buildings and landscapes say about who we are and who we want to be. So, and in my work with architecture students at RMIT, we often start the design process by observing the site or territory and its history, and then we examine how that matches up with the aspirations of its time and our aspirations now. So, and also the stories we tell ourselves. So when I was looking at the exhibition, I guess that question seems to reflect back in various ways, but one of the more sort of direct pieces of work that I thought addressed this question was also Kevin's work. I think this idea of identity and this piecing of different identities and landscapes seem to be really sort of seems to address that question in a really beautiful way. If you could maybe reflect on that.
Yeah, sure. I'd be happy to talk through one of the paintings in the show, Another Rung, and talk about how that painting process and my thought process with those themes come through. So in Another Rung, it's the one where you can see there's figures on ladders, both in the foreground and in the background. And I've been thinking about, and they're both the figures are sort of, building something or creating some kind of structure with these ladders. And I was thinking about this, and the structures, those built structures of the ascending the ladder, they connect also with the natural environment. The perspective that I've used is one as if from a great height and viewing and looking down. So I was thinking about how the way society is structured is very much about this ascension, or this idea that we need to try to make things taller and bigger all the time, and we're always trying to progress. And even the idea of a ladder metaphorically, like in terms of our career individually or in terms of the economy, that there's always another rung to be reached, which is where the title of the painting comes from. I've also included, the figures that I've used are people of colour. I think for myself and from my own personal perspective, I've been thinking as well about, well, within that societal hierarchy, where do people of colour fit in? And I've used as the labourers, people of colour, because, so for example, like last week, I was in a restaurant with my partner, and as we know, a lot of people are getting takeaway at the moment. So there are a lot of Deliveroo people, Uber Eats people coming in to pick things up all the time, and with those horrible, non-ergonomic at all backpacks that are like just completely square, and going out in the rain, not really everyone's first choice of job. And I said to my partner, when was the last time you saw one of these delivery people that was white? So for me, it's also about thinking about how these built structures relate to these natural structures through the painting process, and then reflecting on how that relates to our societal structures and where different members of society fit in amidst those structures.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. I think, definitely over the last few years, the economy of delivery and instant service, like door-to-door service, it's certainly something that I was very familiar with in the US, and the fact that, the demographic that service this is very visible in the streets, but in Australia, not so much until now, and especially now with lockdowns and rings of steel, the sectors of our community who service and keep our economy going, it becomes really interesting. And I think your painting, where these structures, it seems to be like the back of house becomes foregrounded. And I think what's also interesting about the work is this inversion, the sky, the way you piece these fragmented landscapes together, but it has a sort of epic quality, like an aspirational quality as well, which I find very, not necessarily cohesive, but it's very challenging and quite eloquent. And I think this idea of piecing these different landscapes together, like Polly, when I was looking at the videos of these abandoned farmhouses, what I was constantly thinking, like sitting in this really generous space in this dark room looking at this video, and I remember my husband and I were sitting there and we were kind of freezing. It's cold out there, but in these icescapes, it was also quite chilling. But then at the same time, I was constantly imagining this loss, what was erased. Like we were piecing together what that home might have been. And so this kind of, I guess one of the questions is sort of what is erased as we sort of construct spaces, like this economy, the new economy in Iceland of, mining, extraction, and this sort of agricultural economy is abandoned. Is there a sense of longing is there any nostalgia or longing in your work?
I think, there's definitely, for me, there's a sense of trying to negotiate what the past is and is in the present. And I think something that I really feel in terms of Iceland, but I think, in general, abandoned houses for me are entities of themselves. They are these sort of pregnant pauses in the landscape. And there's a lot of connection strangely, between Iceland and Australia for me in lots of different ways. They have these big interiors that are uninhabited, and there are these sort of sections of the country that were once thriving that aren't. And I think what for me in terms of this work in Iceland really reflected for me was there was this real sense of very tight-knit small communities branching out everywhere, which have now been left as agriculture became very much a mass kind of industry. And so farms were bought up, and small communities then shifted into much larger communities. And, these houses are just left as well, which is sort of really interesting to me, and something I haven't seen hugely in Australia. You see an abandoned house and it's largely trashed, or it's, a lot of things are removed from it. But in Iceland, not necessarily that the house in this particular work, but there are houses that are just like, you walk in from the 1950s and everything is still there. And because of the climate as well, things just stay the same. And so there is this really strange space of walking into the past as the present, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's interesting, this, what you say about, well, we don't really see abandoned houses in Australia so much. But working in the university sector during COVID, one of the observations was all this student housing became vacant. And as you probably heard, there were these, programs to sort of bring homeless people into abandoned, well, not so much abandoned, but empty, unused student housing and hotels. And it really made me think, what makes, it really made me reflect on two things. One is what does the idea of home mean to an overseas student? And I teach a lot of overseas students, and quite often by the time they get to thesis, it's almost a little bit of therapy where they sort of reflect back on their lived experience where, when you set up a home in a new place, whether as an overseas student, what do you take with you and what do you leave behind? And how do you make your environment feel homely? And the other thing was to think about, for those homeless people who were taken into these new shelters as such, that whether, their experiences, it's quite, for some it's a great respite, but it seems that for some it's also a trauma of another sort, where what they're used to and what they're familiar with is changed. And I wonder whether perhaps Amanda, like in the work that you do in our community, how did you feel about the idea of home, especially with the community that you work with?
It's interesting that you talk about the hotels, because we've taken some of our residents have come from crisis centres where they've been previously on the street, and I remember one guy that pitched his tent on the bed. So we supply a single bed in the room, so the tent had to go on the bed. And then another one that had lived on the street couldn't sleep in the bed. He had to have cardboard on the floor. Wow. And it took quite a few weeks before he felt comfortable moving into the bed. And so, you were talking before about the question about, who are we and where, I tend to look at our residents and think more about where have they come from, because every resident has a different story, and you can have these residents that have lived on the street because of generally mental health issues, often combined with drug and alcohol issues, but frequently, the mental health issues, and particularly with schizophrenia, it just puts, it's no fault of their own that they end up on the street and then they end up living with us. And then, where to from here for them? How do we create an environment that gives them hope and helps them to think about the future, because their past has been so traumatic that they often, they come to us and all they want is a safe space to be. And that, that's what we try so hard to deliver with our model. So we have on-site managers that live and breathe the community with the people that, and there's 25, 30 people. Our largest property's got 38 people. So it's not, it's not your individual house that you would expect, or we all, generally aspire to. We want to choose the people that we live with. But in this environment, when people are on a disability pension or we're on Newstart or, the new job seeker, people on job seeker cannot afford to live in a place of their own. It's just completely impossible. So they have to share with someone, whether it's an apartment, a house, but generally it's just random people that they don't know. So with us, we've got these huge properties. A couple of them are ex-aged care facilities, and somehow we managed to create a really peaceful place that people can actually start to stabilise and think about their future. And I talk about the people that have been on the street, but then you have the people from the opposite end of the, our society, where we've housed people that have been stockbrokers, commercial Qantas pilots that have just, through mental illness, often later in life, have suddenly had the guts ripped out of their life, and they find themselves stuck in a rooming house. And that, how traumatizing would that be? You just can't think what that would be like for any of us here to suddenly find ourselves unwanted or unable to connect with our families, our traditional supports. And, these people come in and they're basically alone. They've got no one who actually they connect with. And then by having this community with us, they just find someone that they feel like they connect with, and then they find a sense of belonging within this weird massive group home. It's really remarkable.
Yeah, Amanda, it seems like what you're pointing to is that, what makes a home and shelter is more than just the physical space, as important as it is. That there is the, how do you build community, emotional connections, and this sense of stability. I feel like in the work that you do, and you've done it for, quite a long time, you must, what are the fundamentals? It seems like when you're dealing with people who are dispossessed and traumatized, this idea of how do you even, we're all trying, even most of us are very privileged to have a stable home to be in, but in the work that you do, what are the sort of, baseline fundamentals of how to create a sense of home and belonging?
It's a really hard question. I think that a lot of the people that come, they don't necessarily want companionship or friendship, but they find themselves drawn in when people are reaching out to them. And we have good neighbours. We're in Hawthorn and Kew, and I think you tend to think that there's a lot of people would be opposed to having community housing in their street, but the relationships that we've developed with Rotary groups, our neighbours, our churches are really fundamental in helping them feel accepted. So that, I think, is one of the key things, that they come into our properties. I don't want it to be, it could be perceived as a ghetto or an institution, because, this is what we try to escape. We try to escape having a whole lot of people with mental health issues living in the same environment.
Yeah.
But, we didn't set up, across Australia, we didn't set up places where these people could go and be cared for and have their medical and mental health needs met. So we've ended up with these people living in rooming houses. So there's no escaping that. So how do we create something that's safe, where people feel like they're part of a community and belong, as opposed to the other rooming houses. A lot of the other rooming houses that exist in the state, where people are frightened, they're worried about having knives, in their doors. They're worried about standover tactics for money and drugs. Yeah. So how do you create something? How have we created over the years a culture where people feel connected and safe, and where they feel that they belong? And I think it's by making sure that people always feel respected and accepted. And as much as possible, we're trying to include them in the broader community in Hawthorn. And as I was starting to say, that the people in Kew and Hawthorn are just amazing. We've got neighbours around that are trying to, that are including our residents in their garden and vice versa, coming over and helping us with the garden. We've got a group of parents that have put money together to have a skip on site so that we could get some of our rubbish. Like, out of nowhere, people, and particularly through lockdown, we've had meals delivered. Like, there's so much support, and it's not unacknowledged within the residents that they understand that they are loved, maybe for the first time in their life.
Yeah. No, it's really amazing hearing these stories. And I think one of the things that I'm reflecting on, this idea of, I guess what seems to me is that empathy is the first thing, this sense of being safe and understood, and maybe to sort of be able to carry your trauma or history with you, that it's imprinted on you. So you need your cardboard, you need your tent in order to sort of bring something of your past in order to transition into some sense of stability. And when I was looking at the exhibition, I was, looking at Mason's work and these kind of imprints of fragments of buildings and environments. It made me sort of think about how we all bring our histories with us, our stories, and we're looking for some sense of recognition or a place to piece things together with. So I just wonder if, Mason, you could sort of talk a little bit about, your sense of, the importance of history and bringing that, the relationship between the history of a place and a person, as, in your lived experience.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, when I think about a place, and I'm always thinking about this question, like, how do you characterize a place, or how do you locate? Where is something located? Like, is a memory in a thing, or is it stored in the brain like a memory chip? Like, how does that, where's the place in a way? And if I think back to my childhood home, and I think about what do I remember about that place, it's often small details that are associated with usually a kind of sensation, like a touch, like the feeling of a handrail, or the color of a wall, or, some corner texture of some outside brick thing, or some smell. Like, it's these sort of details that to me end up making up the perception of a place for me. So I've tried to kind of focus on that in my work. And when I'm sort of investigating a place in order to make a work, I think about sort of slowness and just the act of noticing. Like, I'm writing a thesis right now, and I've got a whole section just on noticing as a strategy, and you might say, oh, that's just a basic thing, just notice what's around you. It's actually quite hard to notice the details, but I think that these peripheral kind of details, or the things that we sort of do automatically, or, you're mentioning before, Amanda, about the person who had the sort of tent in the room. I mean, that's something that's kind of, they're touching, noticing that's something that's physical, perhaps, that's relational to their body. I feel I can understand having that enclosure is a kind of thing that's intimate. And I feel like architecture can be that sort of intimate thing. And so that's why when I I'm making work, I feel like touching is such a great way to get connected to a place. And so touching is a key strategy for me, even just through feeling a surface, or like I literally look strange just going up and rubbing walls. But somehow when you touch something, it makes a memory more real in a way, or it solidifies a memory. Like if you're touching and feeling, it sort of, I don't know, it concretizes, perhaps is the word. It just makes it it connects you to the building or to the thing. So I feel like sort of textures, touching, intimate details, that's the way that I sort of enter in to the making of my work.
Yeah, look, that makes, am I on? Okay. Yeah, that makes total sense. I think it's almost, the way you describe it is almost like this idea of ritual when we think about how we connect, in a lot of religious practices, or, there is a sense of tactility and material. And even so, this idea of touch alongside other sensory, other senses such as the smell of incense or the sounds of music, it all sort of reaffirms this sense of identity and place. And what's really interesting thinking about that, and then thinking about my experience of experiencing Polly's work, was almost like this sort of, this embalming where, the half the house, half of these living spaces buried under snow, and there is, but at the same time, these videos, you can see you can just hear the sounds of the weather and the wind and the slight shaking of the wood planks that are sort of hanging over, and the sunlight coming over. Like, what is the, I guess, this idea, the importance of material and, tactility. Like, do you want to speak a little bit about that aspect, the sensory aspect of your work?
Yeah, it was really interesting listening to Mason talk about that, because I think that touch is, in my experience, quite related to working with sound and listening, and it is that sort of sensory experience of sights in a particular way. And I think, thinking about shelter and home and these spaces that we inhabit, the sounds of them and the way we listen in them is so integral to them as well. It's how we understand them in a particular way. And I think there was such a, again, an eerie sort of sense of the spaces, and particularly, the one that's in this work, of just these, its own sort of voice and movement. It was constantly creaking, and the sounds of the landscape are sort of moving around it in certain ways, and that difference of the acoustics of what's inside and outside, which is constantly changing. This sort of sense of the building just constantly in some sort of breathing moment in a particular way, but then also the inhabitants that are in those buildings as well, as far as like birds and mice and things that make, bumping, screeching sounds, but just the materials, I think, Vicky, what you were saying, just the materials of those buildings and how they sonically play together just creates this really interesting space of listening, which is very, very sensory and really just attunes you to a certain environment. It keys you in a particular way. And I think that sound is such an important medium in my own work because of that, there's nothing like sound for showing you the unseen. It can tell you just so much about a place that you can never see potentially. And I think that aspect of the acoustic of environments is just really interesting.
Yeah, I think Mason and Polly, the work seems to suggest this sort of absence, or that there is an imprint of human habitation, and then it's vacated or abandoned or left. And then Amanda and Kevin, your work is almost, there's you know, you're dealing with people and populations and demographics and community, like so I guess, Amanda, just thinking about the work that you do and what you said about, well, you know, when people come into the home that that you provide, the shelter that you provide, they don't necessarily want to be connected. They're probably very sensitive and they want to be alone. And in an earlier conversation, I heard you give in describing the home, is that, you know, they sort of have to share spaces to eat. You know, there are these sensory, you know, the smell of food and sharing of a meal in the group home. I think the work that you do to sort of navigate these personalities and these traumas that people have, what does the sensory or the sort of tactile play into the work that you do? Because it's an enormous task sort of navigating, you know, to create a sense of home. So, you know, the idea of food and how do you make the environment peaceful? How do you?
Yeah, it's an important point you brought up about the food, because we all know that eating together is, you know, and is so key to our life with the people that we love, and even people, you know, that we don't know. You might go to some sort of networking dinner. You know, so much is orientated around a meal, and that's been part of our model for years. You know, it used to be, one of our original house used to be a boarding house, and so we took it on as a boarding house, and it does belong to the state government. And when all of the other old boarding houses were being purchased by the state government, I think we were the only community organisation that insisted that we keep the meals.
Yeah.
And everybody else, you know, running a kitchen, trying to feed, I mean, we don't feed people 3 times a day, but we make sure that they get a good, healthy meal in the evening, and that there is breakfast, you know, cereal and toast for them to wake up to in the morning. But it's because it is, you need just, even if they sit down and don't even talk to the person opposite them, they've been cited by other people, you know, so that we will know if someone isn't out of their room and isn't in their normal place. I mean, a lot of them have got their normal place. It's like any home. But I'm just, you know, I'm just reminded of a story I heard this week where some community mental health people, through COVID, knocking on doors, discovered a person in Ashburton that had been not left his apartment, his public housing apartment, for 5 years. He'd had Coles deliveries for 5 years. And that, I can so imagine how that would happen for some of our residents. Their mental health is such that they don't want to be part of anything, but we want to be part of their life. And so by having to come out and eat with people, yes, they don't particularly, you know, wouldn't be their first option, but boy, it's important, isn't it? You know, when you think that someone could be that alone. And so because they do come out, someone every day says, "Hi, how you going? How's your day been?" You know, I mean, it might be exactly the same as yesterday, but at least they're connecting with somebody else. And you can tell that they actually appreciate it, even if it doesn't, you know, they're anxious or something. They know that it's important for them. That I'm thinking about the food, but there's also, when you think about the design of the building, just having places where people can sit and talk together. So a lot of the time the place is, you know, full of cigarette smoke, and you walk through and you try not to breathe in, but that's them. That's what, you know, that is so important to them, to have that little area where they can come, and even the non-smokers will come and sit there because it's a communal space.
Yeah.
And, you know, cigarette smoke. That's part of the sensory thing. It's part of the whole fabric of the building.
Yeah, yeah.
It's in the walls. We've just had the place painted, and I don't know how long we're going to smell like fresh paint before, but they're not allowed to smoke inside. But it drifts in, and that's just part of the part of the the fabric of the building. It's in the walls, and along with our memories, and it's I don't know where to go. It's just too it's just a lot there.
Yeah. And I think this sense of the collective, right? Like, how do we live together in a space, and how do we either tolerate each other or show empathy, and how do we share space? It seems like a constant work for you, right? Like how it's like sometimes I have 5 children. It's sometimes I feel like I've got 35, and that I'm not being derogatory there. It's like you've got a family. They don't always get on. Your brothers, your sisters, your children. They don't always get on, and there's squabbles, and people are irritated because someone left a cup on the bench, but people sort these things out, and the value of community overrides the niggly little stuff that happens. Yeah, and I guess the question of community and who are we in relation to other people, and who are we as a collective? I think that sort of does go back to when I look at Kevin's work and also Kevin's work outside of this exhibition, where I guess where you bring people of colour and this sense of identity, and also our place in society as labourers. I guess I arrived in Australia when I was 7, and my mum, my dad was a quail farmer in a farm in just on the outskirts of Hong Kong. And my mum, we just sort of looked after the farm. But coming to Australia, suddenly they entered this world of labour. My mum was at Victoria Market once, and then she said and then next she was washing dishes, and my dad worked in restaurants. And suddenly this world of the labourers and people who, kids who eat dinner at 11 o'clock at night, and parents who never can go to parent-teacher interviews. There was this new world that opened up to me in Australia. And I think I guess Kevin's work, even though I don't think it's incredibly explicit, but this sense of home, these broad landscapes of the generosity of this country, or this landscape, and then the suburban house, but it's inverted, and it's not the sense of stability and safety is suddenly challenged, or you see the foundations of a house. I find this work seems to resonate with this. Not quite sure how to put it, but this sense of that our sense of who we are as Australians, perhaps, or as people in this country, is constantly being challenged, and that our ground is not as stable as we'd like to sing in our anthems. So I wonder whether, Kevin, you feel, what your reflection is on this sense of the collective and our collective identity.
Sure, yeah. That what you describe about the ground being uncertain is definitely a motif that runs through the paintings, with elements being upside down, like you mentioned, because I do feel like it's something that, for whatever reason, we all have to try to piece together for ourselves. If I talk a bit about Castle Under the Sky, which is the second painting in the exhibition, Vicky, you mentioned that there's this sort of iconic suburban house which is upside down, Actually, the running motif that holds the whole painting together is this shape of the roof, of a roof line that I really associate with a childlike sense of what you associate with a house. It's like how, you know, in school, how you always drew a house, no matter where you actually lived, all the kids always drew the house the same way with the same, with that same roof. And even like, I remember nursery rhymes as a kid and watching Play School, and every time they would sing about a house, they would always do this shape over their head.
Yes.
So, and, you know, what you guys have been saying about how do you capture a memory or a sensibility about a place is very much what I'm thinking about, really in all the paintings, but in this one in particular, that sense of house and maybe it not being as secure as what you would like it to be, or feeling a little unstable for whatever reason. But yeah, this shape you can see repeats in the suburban house in the yellow rooftops at the bottom, which then sort of is reflected back into the unbuilt or in the process of being built structure just above it, which again has that same shape actually reflected many times. And then those built structures then connect back to the natural environment. Actually, the whole painting, you can see the inverted roof line, which is basically like a V section, which runs through the whole center of the painting and basically carries the whole structure of the whole painting itself. All, again, referencing this shape that I really associate with a childlike association with what you want home to be. And it's very much, I mean, you guys were talking also about like color and how you relate back some of those personalized experiences or associations. And it's something that I'm very conscious of with the painting process as well, like in terms of the way I mix different colors and the choice of using a lot of warmth in the palette, in addition to the actual elements that I choose to depict. So trying to carry through this sensibility of wanting to create a safe space for yourself is something that's I really try to embody throughout the paintings. Actually, I have a solo show coming up at Martin Brown Contemporary, which opens on the 14th of October, that actually takes that as a starting point, this idea that lately we've been spending so much time at home and we've been sort of stuck in our own houses and unable to travel. And this whole body of work actually asks, well, then how do we know if right here is truly where we really belong, when so many of us do have some kind of connection with other parts of the world? And that's not necessarily just through ancestry or, I mean, it can just be through interest. Like, I mean, I did a residency in America a couple of years ago, and I'm obsessed with the landscape of around the Yellowstone National Park and those kind of American pine forests, and they keep repeating in paintings over and over again. And I find great comfort in that kind of imagery. So again, it's about, well, how, what all these kind of imaginings of where you think you might be or where you might belong kind of come together to create this, ultimately what I'm trying to create, a scene that is comforting and feels safe.
Yeah, like that's great. I think that sense of like how you can, you know, be removed from your, you know, your place of origin and still redefine your sense of home in a new place, or a sense of belonging, in your case in the US, that you find certain landscapes to be of comfort is interesting. And I wonder, is it to do with a nostalgia of what you imagine the place to be and it matches up You know, like I think about, you know, certainly Yellowstone would, it does answer to your aspirations of what it should be like. But certainly, I guess for other experiences, it may not necessarily do the same. So when you were in the States, what did you feel a sense of belonging, or is that a different thing?
Yeah, I find it really fascinating when people find a real sense of connection with a place that seems quite unexpected.
Yeah.
Like, so I absolutely felt a connection so it was the residency was at Teton Art Lab, which was at the base of Yellowstone National Park.
Wow. Okay.
So yeah, it was amazing. I just spent all my time just wandering around and looking at moose and bears, but the interesting thing is that how much it reflects back to film and TV, and you're talking about this kind of, this aspirational dream space. Yeah. Well, I think that's where there's so much narrative and so much associations that come with, that particular imagery, because of I'm obsessed with watching movies and stuff. We just watched the Twilight series again because of the Pine Forest, and I'm infatuated with the Cullen House. But yeah, there's definitely something aspirational about that is incorporated in different places, especially when you have some connection through media.
Yeah, it's a strange kind of, the relationship between nostalgia and memory sometimes is not the same thing, right? Like the way that our nostalgia is, we sort of bring to it our own sort of aspirations. As children watching movies or looking at landscape calendars, in my case, like my imagery of European forests and American forests is always these these calendars my mum used to get from church. So it's just, and the Australian landscape is anything but. So I always felt that there is this kind of nostalgia for this sort of other kind of landscape. And I guess all of us have been quite lucky in Kevin, Mason and Polly, you've done residences overseas as well. And, what were your experiences of, connection to a place? Where do you sort of start to feel this tipping point where you sort of zoom in on a particular place?
I feel like there's, and I understand that thought, Kevin, of like, when you go to a place and you have an idea of it, and then you have an experience of it, and you're wrestling with both the idea, or it's like there's a representation of a place, and then there's your actual sensorial experience of a place, and like how they both form your understanding of a place. I feel like it's a bit of a tussle in a way. I'm also interested in this idea of like films, like screen memory, Freud's idea of like, they interviewed people from who had an experience and then who watched a film about a similar thing, and then the film influenced their own memory of their original thing, So I feel like memory itself is something that's totally just not fixed. It's just relational completely. Like, and I feel like actions or being at a place or doing something, some kind of movement or an action is something that sparks a memory. And I've had a few sort of residencies, and I made a body of work recently going to my wife's childhood home in the Philippines, which was like a way to get to know her family. But also she had her house where she grew up was really kind of loaded with her own memories. And it used to be a place where her grandmother was like a chef, a lot of cooking. And so while she was talking about all her experiences, I was doing these molds of all the surfaces, bringing silicone in. So it wasn't sort of my memories, but it was the idea of learning about her memories and then the sort of the molds that I took came with the story that she was telling me. So or in a way, the story was solidified by my molds in a way. So that's a funny one there, because it's like, it's not my own memory, but it's my own encounter with her stories, which is a sort of memory. So, yeah.
It's quite interesting. It's almost like a mnemonic that your wife can sort of touch, and this object, like it's one of the sort of thesis about the Stonehenge is it's like a mnemonic full of stories, every nook and cranny, and your work seems to sort of carry that. And what's interesting, what you say about that, in your practice, in creating memories, it requires, or you like to use action, this action of imprinting and capturing something. Whereas Polly, it seems it's about this very quiet observation, almost in some way, almost like a hunter, or at least this observation of being almost invisible, and it's an action of a different kind. And but I guess, in reflecting on that question of your experience of connecting to a place, like what, other than the themes of extraction or your interest in that territory, like personally, did you find, in your just working in that environment, how did it challenge your sense of home and belonging?
Oh, absolutely. And I feel like I'm really in that process again, or I've shifted into another level since COVID as well, with shifting houses and having to be home a lot. And so I feel like I'm, working through that again. But I think definitely through residencies are a wonderful way for artists to just jump into another culture and another space in a particular way, with a focused sort of creative, process around making as well, which is kind of different from traveling or staying in places. But I think for me, I also think for being a first generation settler Australian, the notion of home is discordant. I feel like I don't really have one. I mean, my family is from the UK. When I go back there, I don't feel like that's home, but this is not my home either, really. I can't get away from the reality of it's stolen land. And I think also working a lot in the landscape, you see just how traumatized, the environment is on so many levels and continues to be. And so it's a very uncomfortable place to be in a particular way, where there isn't really a home. And I think my experience of home has really come through stories, films like Mason and Kevin were talking about. And for me, I think Northern Europe and, Iceland, Finland, where, reading Ibsen and playwrights who I just really had such a sense of, the landscape through their writing and through their stories really captured my imagination as a teenager. And so going to those places and sort of feeling what came through those works that I'd read so many years before was such an interesting kind of experience, and that sort of sense of this is completely foreign, and yet there's something I really sense and remember in this place that has been important to me formulating as a person as well. And so that feeling of home for me personally is very sort of fragmented and sort of piecey, but also very dreamy and full of just an imagining really of place. And yeah, I think Kevin, mentioned it before, of that sort of sense of when some people just go to a foreign, country and feel like this is home. This completely makes sense to me. And I know so many people have had that experience, and I've had that experience in moments, but it also shifts. I've had that experience in Australia, and I've lived here largely all my life, but it shifts all the time as well. There isn't a real homing place for me, because it's not, because of the history and the legacy of what this country is, but then also it's not where my people come from. And so my family legacies and stories are just completely different, and something I can't really connect into. And I think it's been really wonderful actually having a practice and being able to work through some of these elements. And I think, as you mentioned, with my work in this exhibition. You know, it really connects to the temporality of what those mediums are with sound and video. You know, there's just a durational quality that fascinates me of being in space and in some way trying to bring that into the gallery and connect with other people through just that lived experience of listening and looking and witnessing in a particular way. Yeah.
It seems to me in this conversation about, it seems to me it's almost like a consensus that the idea of home is precarious, that there is, and especially now, what the tipping point between what feels like home, our sanctuary, can suddenly be a prison or a confinement because of whether it's COVID restrictions or our mental state, or, you know. So I think to me that it seems that what makes home is a shifting and complex thing, and perhaps one of the things that seems to be coming up is this idea of being able to have a home perhaps is a place where we can bring our stories, our history, and it's okay that you can bring your tent, and it can be discordant. It could be unstable, but there is a generosity to sort of, you know, take in all the complexities of, you know, our competing ideas of what home is. And I always feel a sense of comfort almost in accepting that we're all a bit uneasy, that there is an overall, this idea of stability is just, perhaps it's in the idea of community, that we can actually share stories. So I guess, you know, in your own experience during this time, and even with Amanda in working with your residents, have you experienced that there is a sort of a tipping point between home and confinement? I think you've already sort of talked about that you have to almost engineer or sort of nudge people to sort of build community within the residents. And for us, we do this, we connect through Zoom, and we're in Castlemaine and, you know, New South Wales, and for some of us, we're only a few blocks away. But this idea of community seems to be quite important in how we reflect about it, how we reflect on the idea of place. So for you know, maybe I'll open this up to the rest of the panel. In your experience, that feeling of claustrophobia and connection, how do you manage that, and whether your practice has sort of been, you know, whether your practice somehow addresses this?
Vicky, just before we just go to that, can I just make a couple of comments about place and you know, the artists were talking about the places that they've lived and worked, and it just made me reflect on an experience that I had quite a few years ago when we were renting a large property in Baldwin Road in Canterbury, and a neighbour found out that we were there and rang very concerned at our residents not fitting in, you know, and she was saying, these people aren't like us. They will feel terrible living here. And I guess I felt that was probably not correct, that they actually enjoyed living, not just in our house, but living in this beautiful suburb with these beautiful trees, all the facilities around them, if they weren't, I guess the statement I felt came out of perhaps prejudice and ignorance. And it was a bit shocking, to be honest, that there was, you were only allowed to live in this area if you were incredibly wealthy. And just that unwillingness to share the space and the place was pretty heartbreaking, because it means that basically anybody that is poor, despite the fact that they might have grown up in the area and through no fault of their own, be forced to live in cheap digs, that they have to go and live on the outskirts of the city, dislocated from the place that they know. And then in the same context, that there are people that have never lived in Hawthorn because they've never been able to afford it, and then we can offer them a space in Kew and in Hawthorn where they also get to experience the beauty of these suburbs. And for them, it's like, it's such a cut-off for the life that they had to come to here, that it is a new beginning. And, you know, for me, it's given people a new lease of life and allowed them to move on and leave the past behind, which is what they wanted to do. And so I just wanted to put that in because I felt it was relevant to what the artists have been exploring in their work.
Yeah, definitely. Absolutely.
Makes me think about belonging is the word that just keeps coming to my mind when you're saying that. Like there's a difference between feeling like a home but then feeling like you belong somewhere. In Perth, I grew up in this area, which was around kind of these big houses, which had these really strong gates, and the facade was almost like the security. You sort of felt the division, that the facade was such a strong sort of boundary between private and the public space. And I feel sensitive to that. When you go to certain areas, you start to feel like, oh, maybe I'm not really allowed, like I'm not fitting in here, I don't belong, it's not my area, you know. And then when you go to a space where perhaps it's more open physically, you feel like you're a part of something flowing, and you know, you belong to a sort of a network, an assemblage of things. So I feel like architecture and design or planning can actually help determine that sense of belonging, just through opening things up in a way and not creating strong boundaries between things, even if it's just architectural boundaries.
It's interesting. I think the pandemic has really shown up a lot of this segmentation between, so I'm in Melbourne, and so I think we've been seeing a lot of the zoning maps, like the different municipalities and the number of new cases every day. And certainly initially there was a lot of heat on the quarantine workers, often like security guards, cleaners, who are mostly people of colour, who would then so we would see these maps sort of highlight in the western suburbs and in the outer northern suburbs. And it really made that kind of segmentation really clear. So what you were saying as well,
same in Sydney right now. Like this idea that, well, actually you guys belong over here, we belong here. It's become really a lot more pronounced, I think, with the visuals that we've been getting through the pandemic. And it allows for this us versus them mindset as well. There's restrictions for certain areas, you know. It's really pronounced recently in Sydney, where they've bring in the military for the west of Sydney. And I think it should be across the board. But it starts to really the boundaries which you just see on Google Maps, they actually are now felt, you know, in an actual way, because they restricted your movement. And so that's actually, it's actually made it more apparent, the boundaries that are not physical, but are actually still there.
I think that perfectly sort of addresses that question of, you know, what is your your own community and space suddenly becomes a prison that, you know, once those protocols are put in and you're restricted, this idea of freedom and home and belonging is kind of discombobulated. So no, I think, you know, I guess, you know, I thank you all for your, you know, input in these questions that, you know, we've been thinking about in relation to this exhibition. I think it's probably time to sort of open it up to our audience. If there are any questions or comments from anyone who might be viewing.
We haven't had any come through yet, but maybe we can wait a couple of minutes to see if anyone would like to ask anything.
Sure, but I think and I think Amanda, you know, your comment, your commentary about where you know, this sense of belonging, and I guess it's also, you know, coming from an architecture design background, that there is a responsibility of how we create environments that are generous and can embrace, you know, we like to think of ourselves as multicultural and diverse, and yet our environment doesn't always communicate that. And I think what you're pointing to is that, you know, how that, you know, can our environment sort of create a sense of generosity that I think in a lot of our design studios at RMIT, where we're sort of dealing with the urban realm, it's often less about the form and the shape of the building. It's more about, you know, how do we create connections? How do people behave in a community, and how do we foster a sense of vitality, identity? And those questions are always rife with contradictions because, you know, we do live in a diverse society, but it's not always cohesive. So, and I think a lot of the things that you've brought up really speak to that. And it's a sort of an ongoing conversation in our teaching.
And just on that, I have to say that the architecture of the building and the place is absolutely vital. So if, you know, if there are students listening and they want to get involved in the community housing space, I'd really encourage it, because it's so important when when community housing is being designed, built, planned for. It needs people that have thought through some of these issues, because we've managed a few different buildings, and the building itself can have a huge impact on how people interact and engage with each other, and cannot be underestimated and understated. So.
Yeah, like I think, you know, on that point, one of our sessional staff who teach in our bachelor program, Sophie Dyring from School of Projects, and they've been working with projects that house elderly women, or it's specifically for women, to create these communities where women can, you know, live in affordable housing but together as a community. And it's these really interesting initiatives that it's out there probably, and it seems to be that's a very inspiring sort of set of design initiatives that are happening in Melbourne right now. But on the same token, I guess it also points to, you know, at the beginning of COVID, at the snap lockdown, and suddenly we have, our commission houses that are sort of locked down, and suddenly the question of how impoverished some of these environments are for our communities, that they completely rely on the local amenities of the inner city. But once you cut that off, their own space is just you know, completely inadequate. So, yeah, I think the importance of design in addressing these issues is you know, really apparent now.
I think we've got a bit of a shy audience today, but I wanted to ask the artists. Kevin, you've already mentioned that you've got an upcoming show at Martin Brown Contemporary up in Sydney, but I just wanted to ask what you're all working on at the moment and what's coming up for you in your practice.
I'm sorry, Mason.
No.
Do you want to go?
There you go.
I was going to say I've been trying to get to the west coast of Tasmania now for a year and a half, but I think it's been postponed about 2 or 3 times. So I've got a residency with the Unconformity to work in Queenstown. So that's really been my big focus. So I'm not sure if it's the same for Mason and Kevin, but because my work tends to be based in, you know, insights and locations and that I tend to have to travel for, I've really had to bring things back in and sort of pivot a little bit to research and writing, which has been really actually wonderful for my practice. But that's the next thing coming up for me, apart from some a book that's being released by Onomatopoeia Projects in the Netherlands at the end of the year, and another small artist novella which has just come out through a published event from another Tasmanian space. That they're sort of my focus is really getting over to Tasmania and doing that residency and making a new film work.
Great. Yeah, I'm the same as you, Polly. I need to respond to a place, I feel like that's always the starting point to the work. And I've been doing a lot more. Yeah, right. I'm 1 year into a PhD, which is across sort of painting and architecture, looking at surface basically. And been thinking more and more as well as like, what is the site as well? Because I'm trying to think about the studio in a sense as a site, as a kind of place where things come together, and keeping sort of open to that. But what I had lined up was this new kind of project, which was a permanent wall relief in a house, which I'm really excited about because I've been wanting to go sort of a little bit outside of an art gallery context and more in a architectural context. And so this client has seen my work recently and then has this like sort of feature wall in the house that he envisioned me to come and sort of respond to the site and then develop a sort of permanent wall relief that would somehow draw upon the history of the place, but also be in a sort of open and abstract sort of wall render. So I'm trying to use that as a kind of case study for how painting and architecture can come together in this surface material sort of way. So I'm excited to get stuck into that.
Yeah, I feel like I've had to pivot a bit as well because this whole painting series that is being shown in Sydney in October was made in the last 18 months while all this has been going down. So actually we were talking a bit about how this overlap between real lived experience and your memories and actually your aspirations or your imaginings of things. And I think that's come through a lot more in this next series that I've been working on. There's a lot more of a dream space being generated because I have had to sort of imagine these travels a lot more than I normally would. And there's a bit more of a spaciousness to this series as well, I think because of this sort of more this sense of separation that has really come through really strongly in the last 18 months and this greater sense of distance, both locally, but also with regards to us not being able to go overseas as well, and some of those connections sort of becoming more absent. So there's a bit more of a spaciousness, which adds to this sort of dreamy aspect to this new series for me as well.
Thanks, everyone. We have had a flurry of questions, so I'll just, we've only got a few minutes left, but I'll see if we can get through them. So the first one is, how will adaptive design change the way we design our homes and public spaces to cater for our diverse communities and needs? And it's not addressed to anyone, so it's an open question.
Yeah, look, maybe I can speak to that a little bit. Adaptive design, I guess, right now in the design studio I'm running in the master's program, we're looking at Victoria Street, Richmond, Abbotsford, on that sort of borderline. And that certainly is a diverse community. And I guess in terms of adaptation, we talk about resilience and adaptation. We take inspiration from nature. Adaptation often happens in border conditions that are porous, where there is interaction between different species, forest edges, wetlands. And then we use that analogy to sort of bring into the sort of urban landscape and wider community. And I guess in terms of adaptation, we think about programs that can coexist together. So, and that already happens, like new immigrants, when they arrive in they quite often just convert their homes into little factories or workspaces. And we all are sort of learning to do that now, but that is actually something that, if you look at Victoria Street, all the families who lived on the top apartments, they were also running small businesses, or multiple businesses at the same time. So this kind of, and that mixity also creates a publicness where people interact. So the blurring between home and community spaces are generated through that sort of ambiguity. So I guess that's sort of how I think about that question of adaptation. Isn't necessarily, it's probably a lot to do with program and how we curate the movement of people and how to foster interaction.
Thanks, Vicky. I think we've run out of time, unfortunately. Perhaps we might just have time just for one more question. Have you seen the ways that there can be a certain symbiosis between artistic practice or personal approaches to creation and have an impact on the way we think about designing spaces that can think about these concepts of belonging and home in a more general and meaningful sense, i.e. junctures between artistic practice and design / practical application into the public space?
I've been thinking about this one a bit and about sort of undesigning, or like how far design can go in terms of drawing and planning and engineering, but then getting to a stage where you've got the building, and then how do you infuse the building with a sense of place? And I think that comes down to this kind of relational touching in terms of responding to the place and the surface of the building, or somehow focusing on surface to accumulate this relational thing. So even incorporating, not fully determining the design of something before you begin, but having the structure of it and then allowing the surface to then build or grow this relational aspect. I'm thinking about that. I don't know how to fully articulate it yet, but that's what the PhD is for. But the surface being a site where this relation can happen.
Thanks, everyone. I guess that brings us to the end of our session. And thank you to all of the guests who have joined us today. And thank you so much to everyone on our panel for your participation and your insight. It's been fascinating to listen to. If you had any questions that we were unable to get to during the session, please feel free to email them to us. Our email address can be found in your registration confirmation email. Please join our digital community by signing up to our e-news via the City of Boroondara website and follow Town Hall Gallery on social media. You will receive a follow-up email from us that includes a link to the recording of this session, so please feel free to share it with others who may be interested. We'll also send you a survey to tell us about your experience. And as always, we really appreciate your feedback. Shelter in Place is now showing at the Town Hall Gallery until Saturday, the 25th of September. In line with current public health directives, Town Hall Gallery is closed to the public, but in the meantime, you can view the exhibition online via the Boroondara Arts website and under online exhibitions. And of course, we'll communicate via our channels as soon as we can reopen. Today's event was the first in a series of public programs associated with this exhibition. We're also running an online described tour with Description Victoria. We're hosting a cinema session where we're screening the documentary Architecture of Infinity, which is a film about spirituality and architecture. And we'll also be running some in-person exhibition tours as well once we reopen. So for more information and to book, please visit the Boroondara Arts website. Thank you everyone again. Take care, stay safe, and please enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thanks, Steph. Thanks,
Thank you.
everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank